So welcome everyone to this special edition of MTalks in what's become quite a unique new season of MPavilion. My name is Alexis Kalagas and I'm excited to be joined today all the way from New York by Andrés Jaque. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that MPavilion is hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are watching today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Victoria and all across Australia. Now, the theme for the December program of MPavilion is IRL, Exploring Social Spaces. And as Melbourne emerges out of lockdown and much of the Northern Hemisphere unfortunately moves in the other direction, the one constant has been the way the pandemic has accelerated existing trends towards the hybridisation of our online and offline worlds. We see this embrace of virtual forms of interaction and connection in all parts of our lives, from work to dining to romance and many others. But today we're going to focus especially on what it means for our experience of the city, and the city in the broadest possible sense. So that is what it means when the boundaries between the physical and digital spaces we inhabit in an urban environment begin to blur. Another result of extended lockdowns this year has been a reappraisal of our domestic environments, from their design to the way they shape how we relate to each other, to the symbolism of a domestic space as glimpsed in the background of a Zoom call. I can't think of anyone better to explore the implications of all this than Andrés, who's opening up new ways of seeing and engaging through the lens of architecture and design. Andrés is an architect, a writer, a curator, and founder of the Office for Political Innovation, an agency based between New York and Madrid, though he's joining us from New York today, and which since 2003 has worked at the intersection of research, critical environmental practices, and design. Andrés also directs the Advanced Architectural Design program at Columbia University in New York and is chief curator of the upcoming Shanghai Biennale. The provocative work of Andrés and his team, which has been awarded the Silver Lion at the Venice Biennale, has been shown at the Design Museum in London and is held by MoMA and the Art Institute of Chicago, explores architecture as the trans-scalar entanglement of life, bodies, technologies, and environments. This work has touched on everything from porn to Silvio Berlusconi, to Tupperware, to fracking, to the demand for designer babies and the image of James Franco. Mm-hmm. We'll touch later on just what a trans-scalar approach to architecture means. But first, Andrés, thanks very much for joining us and welcome virtually at least to this new season of MPavilion.
Thank you very much, Alexis. I'm very happy to be here, whatever it means, here, now.
Before we sort of launch into your project, the projects you've done and research, and I should say to everyone that Andrés has just published a fascinating book called Superpowers of Scale that is a really great overview of the work that he's been doing. But I wanted to begin first, I think, with your own experience of the pandemic, which has obviously become the kind of defining way that everyone around the world has experienced 2020. And particularly, I guess, ask you whether it's impacted the way that you think about architecture, and particularly this connection with technology.
Yeah, this pandemic has shown what is the way the world is constructed and what is that we can mean by architecture now. Also, it has shown what are the challenges that both the world, bodies, I would say, and the discipline and the field of architecture face. With regards to the first part, I think that all the efforts to encapsulate and isolate our bodies are intrinsically talking of something very unique of the moment we live in. It's the unavoidable reality that our bodies are entangled, are porous to many other forms of others. So the entire modern culture of creating a we of white, Western, well-educated, mostly male, mostly heterosexual, kind of rich or well-doing humans, it's been very much denied now. I mean, before it has been, of course, by many other means, but now it's impossible to maintain that that's happening. Basically, we are constituted in otherness. We are composed by the way virus can really go through our skin and get into our bodies. We are entangled with others by the way we basically share the air, share the water, share the infrastructures that are both connecting us, separating us, but also enacting us as porous beings. And this might be seen as something minor, but for me it's crucial. In a so divided world, we are basically seeing what is the way that our bodies are connected to other things, and we're not individuals, we're not zipped up bodies, we are actually constituted in the interconnection, interdependency, and entanglement with others. And this is huge, in my opinion, because the entire notion of neoliberalism is based on the possibility of individual actors gaining autonomy and kind of detaching from others, the possibility of developing offshore economies, the possibility of securing the humans from the earth, from the resources that we depend on. And this is really the multiplying the growth as something that could keep growing forever. All this is kind of cracking. And this pandemic, beyond the health crisis, is showing us how we're constituted in forms of togetherness that very much deny the power of nation states, the power of modernity, the power of kind of the neoliberal paradigm of individuals competing to each other in a perpetual growth. This is something that for me it's very important, and it's connected to a notion of ecology. We've seen how all these crises resulted in a form of vulnerability that was very much founded in the capacity of habitats to be occupied by human expansion, and then kind of showing us and building us as vulnerable. And for me, this is mostly telling us not only how our kind of modern neoliberal sort of exclusion-based paradigms are cracking, but also probably what's the direction in which we need to keep thinking, a direction much more connected to entanglements rather than divides, a direction that probably has to do more with collectivity and togetherness rather than individualism, and also a direction that has to do with bodies, technologies, infrastructures, environments, kind of ultimately working in solidarity. And this solidarity is not a moral category, it's a physical one. And by solidarity, I mean in mutual porousness and mutual fragility in a way. And that for me, it's great in a way, because it's giving us an opportunity. I mean, in the middle of all this drama, catastrophe, it's giving probably also an opportunity to rethink where we are and where we are with regards to others, and probably a huge change in our culture and definitely for architecture.
There's a lot there, I think, to unpack in what you just said. And there's definitely, I'd like to talk in a moment, I guess, about some of these ideas of interconnectedness that I think are really kind of define your work in many ways, and the way that at least from my perspective, you bring a very different sort of approach to how, to the practice of architecture, but also thinking about the role of design as well. But I think just specifically thinking about communication, kind of connection during the pandemic. Obviously, in the online kind of introduction to this event, I made reference to this fact that on 29th of March, or basically the very beginning of the pandemic, or at least the beginning, I guess, outside of China, Tinder users swiped 3 billion times, and that was the most that had ever been recorded in a single day on the app. And I thought it was such an interesting thing because right at this moment when all cities around the world were all going down into lockdown, and the ability to actually encounter somebody, which is always the thing that you assume something like dating apps are for, this to kind of mediate this relationship that will end up in a physical encounter, that suddenly became impossible. And people would turn into virtual forms of connection, which you expect when it comes to family or friends, but this was also happening with strangers. And for me, like one of the first projects of yours that I really encountered and resonated with me was Intimate Strangers. And partly it was because in 2014, I started to get very interested in the idea of dating apps as an urban phenomenon. And I published an essay about how they sort of mediate our relationships between users, but also with mediate our experience of urban space. Then, of course, I discovered that you had been working on a project, a long-term project, looking at some of these themes and a lot more with Grindr. And I particularly just wanted to, there was one comment you've made about Grindr, that it's become a kind of urbanism in itself, and it challenges the idea of the online being virtual. And you know, I think it's so kind of fitting for this moment we're in now, with where people starting to question what is this relationship between the online and offline. And I was just wondering if you could explain a bit about how that project came to be, what it involved, Intimate Strangers, and then also what you learned through that research as well.
In 2008, as cell phones with GPS were being launched by Apple, Samsung, and Nokia, Sim Kai, Morten Beck Diddleson, and Scott Llewellyn developed in over 6 months the first version of a location-based application that they called Grindr, a name composed by combining guy and finder. It was designed to help gay men easily find other gay men in close proximity.
Yeah, I do believe that it all started when I had been looking into social media and doing research actually on the origins of social media, and then the Design Museum in London, they were changing their venue, their site, the location, and then they were opening with a big exhibition where they asked a few people to say what were the most relevant designs in their field. And as an architect, I thought that probably there was nothing as relevant in the way that it had changed our medium, our environment, our bodies, our societies than Grindr. And Grindr as the first locative social media that was like the first locative social media for hookups, and then followed by Tinder and many others. And I thought it was very relevant because it was transforming not only the, let's say, uses of the city or things like that, but beyond that, it was really transforming our societies, the way they were constituted, from the notions of intimacy to the entire kind of economies and real estate hegemonies, and even the access to resources, when you were capable to kind of tracking all it implied. As you very well said, and I totally agree with you and with your work, like the notion of the kind of real world, the material world, and then a virtual world has totally been challenged by locative media and social media at large, as much as basically the notion that a digital enhancement would make proximity irrelevant. What was very interesting for me about Grindr is that first, it was probably one of the first digital technologies that was in a very intense way creating proximity, constructing the proximity as a space of interaction and a space of intimacy among strangers, which was very, very unique. There was a tradition, of course, of cruising within the ecosystems of gayness and queerness, but let's say that it never had this massive dimension that it gained now, and that it was not only about, let's say, genitality. Actually, Grindr invented, together with Tinder afterwards and others, a new form of sexuality that probably, in which probably interior decoration, language, online interaction, economies, forms of political activism, consumerism became altogether a form of sex that also tells about bodies that are not that much genitally centered, but are finding sex in kind of arousement, in buying, in trading, in accumulating value, in stylishing, in other forms of expression and interaction that are exceeding the realm of genital intercourse. And this was very important to me. When it comes to the distinction between the virtual and the let's say the so-called real, it's impossible to, or the material and the virtual or the immaterial. When we look carefully to the way that Grindr has transformed the physical environment we live in, we live by, I say it's radical. This is the result of a 2-year research where we had access to the archives of Grindr, and we could see even and work with their technical staff and experts in tracking some of the urban users, and not only urban, because I think one of the things that Grindr challenges is that the idea that everything happens in the city. It happens elsewhere in a different kind of spatial enactment, but it's not a city, it's not contained by cities. But one of the things that we could see is that Grindr had a trajectory that was very critical. It started more or less as a way to densify spaces for minorities. Like the entire thing grew from Mamaroneck, where Joyce and Kyle live, a kind of upstate location in the suburbs in New York, and basically, in Long Island, and basically where gay people would be not that densely occupying the space, and then Grindr was intended to make their interconnection similar to the one that they could have in Paris. That was actually the project, where there's a higher population density, and therefore a higher possibility for gay people to find match in proximity. And that was the original purpose of Grindr, and therefore it was kind of an emancipation device for gay male initially, and sort of a little bit participating of certain notions of queerness. But progressively, as the company grew, as Landy Smither was hired as artistic director, marketing director, and basically the owner wanted to maximize the price, the value of the company to be sold basically in the market, then it progressively became a market for lifestyle, and therefore it was the moment in which basically a new notion of sex would be attached to fashion, interior design, consumption, lifestyle, and sort of editing of one's kind of consumer profile. And for me, that also indicated a progression of cities in which basically real estate became a hegemonic form or force, in a form of sex that was very much about a very different kind of interaction. So when someone passed their finger on and kind of move it through the borosilicate screen of a cell phone, basically it's a form of sex in itself, a sex that is happening to a compound of things, or kind of a composite of things, where the phone, the photographs, the backgrounds, as you mentioned before, they all become part of bodies, and that becomes part of a form of sex. And for me, that was very important to learn somehow, because the city was the space that maximized the possibility for sexual encounter for humans, and not only for humans. And now that's happening in places like Grindr. But of course, it doesn't come neutral. It comes with certain ideologies. And those are, in my opinion, the ideologies that Grindr enacted.
Mm-hmm. when reading about that project, like there's this quote, I guess, that's become quite famous from Edward Glaser, the economist, who focuses on particularly on urban economics and sort of how economics shapes the city. And he's described cities as the absence of space between people. Like that's to him the defining characteristic of a city. And you've written that social settings today aren't defined by space, but instead by networks of exchange and interaction, which I think is kind of what you're talking about now as well. And I think, if you kind of extrapolate beyond Grindr and even just beyond dating apps, do you think digital platforms are reinventing what we understand the city to be? And if so, what do you think the implications are for architecture and for design?
Yeah, this is a crucial question. I'm really happy that you're doing this question, because for me, first, I must say that the binarism, city, countryside, or whatever, city, suburbs, it's really dated. Whatever we discuss in these terms, I think that, so your question is very good, because it's true, it's redefining the space of interaction and the kind of networks of interaction. So this is quite relevant. I think that when we look in detail how our lives are constructed and constituted, and we see that it's not possible to say that they happen in a kind of patch in the land that we call city, but they're distributed in kind of the interaction and the assemblage of a number of different locations, infrastructures, expansions, and environments. Like that's also very important when it comes to social media, where the servers, the kind of the data centers where we exist actually as digital beings are. Where is the corn or the oil that we are constituted by produced? What are the rights of those animals? Like all these things are not new things. They are popular culture. We're all highly aware of this. But the very unique thing, going to your question, is that division and violence became invisible, as opposed to like gated communities, for instance. That is something that was very important in the 1990s. A big part of the inequality was expressed through the architecture of clear exclusion, spatial exclusion. What we see now is that divides are happening in shared spaces, in sharing the same air, the same land, the same shops, the same airports, the same banks, the same regulations. But it doesn't mean that we're all together there. These togetherness are formed in divides. This is something that is very much coming from military technology, or from the way military technology evolved with colonization. And I think, for instance, the work that Samia Heni has done in understanding how the colonial forces were interiorized and they became invisible within societies. The divides are now operating with vaccines. Soon we will see people with vaccines coexisting with others without them, as we've seen people with health care sharing the same waiting rooms, the same subway, the same streets of others with others that don't have health insurance. And we see that those divides are coming to our genes. You mentioned before the work that I did, my office, researching on fertility clinics and how they are designing the genes and even the appearance. But the main thing is that then divides could be introduced in our genes or in their genes, and basically allowing humans to share space with others that are radically divided from. And this is something that is a very different culture. I would say that we're still probably architects very much dreaming and romanticizing about welfare and about the public space, but that is something totally of the past. Even if we created now a public space, The question is not whether we can share the streets. We do that, but it doesn't mean that we're developing forms of equity. That's not the case. Even if we have shared streets, or even if we have, the question now in architecture move to other scales, to other technologies. And that's where we have to grow our capacities. If we want the traditions of urbanity to be informing contemporary times and introducing in the present all those parts that are being excluded, then we need to work with other technologies at other scales and in other processes that are not really the ones of space, probably. I don't think space is something that is so relevant anymore. What is probably relevant is how we compose ourselves as planetary in a way, as expanding through different technologies, and what is the way that that is part of political tensions that we need to address now.
I think it's this leads perfectly onto the next question which I was going to ask, which was about politics. I think I read a very interesting interview you did in Volume, talking about citizenship and ideas of the connection between digital literacy and ideas of citizenship, which obviously feels very relevant given what's going on in the US and the sort of role of misinformation or disinformation in sort of shaping ideas around politics. But also you had this great quote, "Politics no longer happens in squares." And you talked about, but at the same time, you talked about architecture as an opportunity to rethink politics. So I was wondering if you sort of see politics and spaces of politics being kind of exploded into this much larger scale. How do you think that architects who are interested in politics and interested in having a political impact can actually intervene? Yeah,
that's a very good question. And very relevant, because I must say that we came to this discussion at this point with years of, let's say, the wrong discussion in architecture about politics and engagement. I would say that architecture is political, no matter what. Like it's always political. It's not a choice of architects to decide whether their work is political or not. Architecture is always imbricated in the way the world is constructed, and it's doing that, of course, with certain agency, not an absolute agency, but certain degree of agency that is negotiated between architectural devices and other actors. And on this, of course, we have the entire tradition of the STS, and our colleagues from the STS have been exploring what's the way that technology operates politically with shared agendas. But I think that there's other realms that we have to be paying attention to, and the entire tradition of feminism and material feminism, I would say, not the one that is more focused maybe on identity issues, but the one that is really thinking of the way the material world is, it's constructing the way that humans gain agency, either individually or collectively. And the third, I would say that for me, it's been very important, is the entire realm of queer ecology, post-human studies, and of course, trans studies, in the way, for instance, people like Jack Halberstam, Paul Preciado, or Riles Norton are talking of trans not as something that has to do with the process of trans emancipation only, but beyond that, thinking of trans as a category that explains how bodies, environments, infrastructures are built together through transitioning processes. And for me, that's those, I want to be very clear on what are the sources of the position that I'm defending in architecture. In architecture, I defend that basically the political engagement of architecture, it's something that is negotiated between many different forces. But that architecture has a crucial role in the political performance of an existing ecosystem. And that has to do with the fact that our material world is allowing certain things to be more likely and others less likely. So there's a force of both encouragement, let's say, and repression that happens to the way our material world and our physical worlds are constructed. And that is something that means, for instance, that the way, for instance, we distribute water, the way that toxicity is dealt with, either something that could be sent somewhere else or dealt with on site, has crucial consequences. The reason why we did, for instance, the project Cosmo at the PS1 was basically because New York is sending its trash, its waste, to places like Susquehanna Valley or Kentucky, and therefore there's a huge environmental inequality that is constructed through those practices. And we think that, I think that architecture could really mediate that and really confront that inequality by developing experiences in which it is proved that it's possible to deal with toxicity in proximity to the place where it is produced. And that form of kind of coexistence with toxicity at the same time has a political value, but also is reconstituting our bodies as bodies that coexist with toxicity. So it's really confronting the possibility of purity and intersecting it with the notions of inequality, and therefore reinventing the human as probably a human that, in order to be fair, has to embrace toxicity. Those for me are the kind of political moves that architecture is doing now. And I think that's happening both in a negative way, I would say. We see how, for instance, the entire, let's say, connection of architecture, okay, architecture catering to a culture of high-end or high-endcracy, as I call it, it's an option that could be confronted by other possibilities in the way that, let's say, different social tissues could be rearticulated differently. For me, architecture now, when we look at the strong kind of prevalence of, let's say, real estate hegemonies, is a form of dissidence. And I must say that this dissidence is not a dissidence of radical kind of positions, but a work of infiltration. And that is very important. I think any architecture, any relevant architecture now needs to be confronting huge binarisms like rich versus poor, people with documented citizens with non-documented, the franchised versus the disfranchised, but also human versus non-human, natural versus technology, north versus south, male versus female. All these binarisms that obviously are anchoring us in a culture of the past somehow are the space in which architecture is operating now politically, but it's not doing it in a neutral way. Many of these forces are doing that to expand the power of neoliberalism. Others are trying to grow in the cracks of these hegemonic powers and are trying to bring alternative within by expanding the spectrum of the possible. For me, that is the form of architecture that I want to do now, and the one that I engage with, this kind of dissidence within that is not only questioning binarisms, but is trying to operate in the cracks of the hegemonics to bring diversity and inclusion within.
Definitely, and I see that, you know, I guess in a more intervening in the discourse rather than in a kind of material way in your Ikea Disobedience project, for example, is, you know, and again, I'm also very interested in this range of projects that you've done that have kind of brought this interest in the political into the home, and the home is not this arena that's kind of neutral and free from politics. And obviously it's very, again, very relevant in this time of the coronavirus, where everyone is at home, but not just that everyone is sort of at home, and as I said at the beginning, reappraising their homes just because of the amount of time they're spending there, but also we've never seen so intimately into everyone else's home, like now. And I was, I mean, it would be great if you could maybe explain a little bit about that Ikea Disobedience project and sort of how you see the role of the media in all this as well, because obviously you design buildings and you design things like the Cosmos installation at MoMA PS1, but you also do a lot of work that's really kind of media production in a way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it'd be great if you explain a little bit about that project, but also why you think it's important that kind of material politics that you're talking about means that we should also be focusing on these everyday kind of domestic contexts as well.
I myself consider myself a designer, but design now implies research, activism, and implies kind of acknowledging that we live a multi-medium world. So any architectural action, it's multi-medium. It's not an option. It is. Since the late 60s, I would say that environment, the discussion of the environment, the ecosystemical condition of our constitutions go together with the way that the material is mobilized also as a source of interaction and communication. So these two notions, the kind of multi-medium, I would say, and the medium as something that is shaped by the way materiality is dynamized in an environmental paradigm, I think is crucial. Marshall McLuhan was talking of communication as something that could be environmentalized and therefore become invisible, something that you don't really pay attention to, but it's working in bringing bodies and more than bodies together. At the same time that there were groups that were exploring at the origins of ecological action in architecture through communication. And I can think, for instance, of environmental communications in LA, for instance, among many others. So the construction of architecture as a multi-medium, I would say, as both ecosystemical and shaped by the dynamism of interaction and entanglement, I think is where we are now. So from this point of view, I'm doing now, for instance, a school in Madrid or a museum in Venice, but they all kind of unfold as multi-medium, as things that have to do as much with connecting bodies, providing spaces of interaction and communication as much as, but that's imbricated in the way bricks or pipes are placed. So I could claim that being an architect now, it's operating in a multi-medium environment, and that requires actions that before were seen as distributed in different disciplinary realms as something that needs to be assembled in architecture if we want to be relevant. This is not something new. One of the reasons why I was so interested in Berlusconi is that the origin of his power, his mean power, I would say, or his wrong use of power, was really architecture. But he understood that architecture was what he called polyedric. It was the assemblage of different mediums, the kind of medium of TV, and that was the origin of mediated, with the medium of bodies. And he was inventing the Bellinas and the number ones and all these new human types that he was giving names to, and that he was photographing, selecting the models, deciding how to stylize them, how they would perform, a kind of entire kind of design of different species in a way. And that was combined with an environmental design and eventually with forms of architecture, these apartments that he invited. And so all these came together, and by combining them together, he became powerful as the one that could control this together with others. Same happened with Ikea in the same period of time, actually. And I must say that Ikea is so successful in controlling these assemblages of different mediums that we don't even perceive Ikea as an architectural actor, whereas it's much more important that I don't know, Rem Koolhaas or Harshen de Meron, immensely more important, to the extent that the IKEA catalog is published in more languages than the Bible now and in larger numbers. So basically, IKEA is probably the most important book of these times that we live in, and definitely much more important than any other architectural device, I would say. Still is perceived as a little bit of a panda bear. At the time that we did IKEA Disobedience, there was almost no criticism to IKEA. It was perceived a little bit like the panda bears of design because they had made available kind of good design so everyone could have nice homes that looked a little bit like the Imeses. By the way, the Imeses, again, another panda bear of architecture that were directly connected to SIA and to the Cold War, and that we also researched and kind of confronted. For me, it's very important to grow our architecture in the cracks of IKEA, in the cracks of the Imeses. And in the case of IKEA, very radically, because when we did the IKEA Disobedience project, it was very close to 2008. It was the time of evictions. Actually, we were looking at cases that were, some of them facing eviction, and the entire purpose of the project was to really show that these very important spaces of social interaction that were sort of the Amazonia of political action within domesticity, and by Amazonia I mean like a rich legacy, was very much being jeopardized by IKEA and by everything that comes with IKEA, like neoliberalism, banks, investment funds, hedge funds buying public property, governments disinvesting in public housing. So all that came together to the extent that the case of IKEA was a form of kind of preservation. One of the cases, for instance, Candela was an incredible case of dissidence to this familiar, pacified or pacific life that IKEA promotes, this kind of realm that is denying the way homes have been spaces of political action and dispute and antagonism. Candela was in the center of one of these cases that we were archiving, therefore trying to preserve, because she was living out of her pension with her 3 daughters, grandchildren, all of them females that were suffering in many different forms, sexism, with many animals as well. They had almost no economy, formal economy, like capitalist economy, but had developed a parallel economy that was based on trust. They would cook, and Candela would cook for a number of people of their neighbors that would come every day to lunch with bags of food. And they would take care of they would babysit her for her grandchildren. They would walk her dogs. There was a kind of trust community that was really not exchanging bills or checks or anything like that, but they were sustaining themselves in a form of exchange that was no accounted. It was not based on, okay, I paid for this, now you pay for this. There was not an exchange or an accountability. It was just based on trust. Candela received she was notified eviction because she has no money to pay for the tiny expenses that she had to pay to the Madrid public housing company. So the fact that she was in the IKEA Disobedience archive and she had been in the newspapers, her case was exhibited in MoMA, was very useful in mobilizing, and we worked together with a number of associations to mobilize protesters and to find lawyers that could work pro bono to defend Candela. And that eviction and many others that came with her announcement were paralyzed. So for me, it's a very clear case of how working with the symmetrical tools, or with the same tools and methodologies that IKEA is used to invade our intimacies and domesticities and our togetherness, could be used to confront that power by using photographers, advertisement campaigns for the IKEA Disobedience, collective action, scaling up of individual forces, basically what Ikea would do to colonize everyone's domesticities, we could use to confront that. And this happily was a very successful case in which actually the eviction of Candela and many others could be stopped with the contribution of Ikea Disobedience. So for me, it's a very important project because it shows, and it goes to your question, what is that architects can do to engage politically? Probably we have to use the tools that have been used to basically unfold and deploy hegemonic powers, but using them in reverse to actually find opportunities to confront those powers and introduce alternatives and dissidents within.
And another project that I think I see real kind of connection with that you've done is the Roll-In House for the Roll-In Society. And I guess you were probably doing them at a very similar time in a way. But again, a project that sort of looks at not how, it actually questions, well, how is space and kind of domesticity actually experienced in the city and not in real life, and how do these sort of broader forces start to shape, well, I think in the case of that project, these more kinds of transient but also transnational lifestyles. And I think to me, I mean, I think there's something very interesting you were doing there about looking at how these sort of existing spaces in the city are occupied in different ways because of these lifestyle shifts. But I think also making this connection again to sort of emerging digital infrastructures that allow these new types of living as well. And I was wondering, if you could explain a little bit about that project as well, and maybe how you see this connected to some of the other work that you've done.
Yeah, this was a crucial project for us, and it was also the project that gave origin to the project that we presented in the Venice Biennale with Kazuyo Sejima. And somehow it gave visibility to our office. So it was a crucial project for us. And precisely we're trying to see the way the online, that then kind of initiating online in forms of interaction were reflecting on the built environment, let's say, and were not only reflected or reflecting, but also kind of becoming the built environment in a very inseparable way. And that was very real, for instance, in cases of money transfer in transnational communities, but also in the way the Erasmus communities, the students that could exchange their university for short periods of time, for 1 term or 2 terms, that were promoted by the European Union, were actually using Facebook in a very initial moment of Facebook, combined with low cost of air companies to develop a form of life that was non-familiar and that was based on the temporary sharing of space, of apartments. Sharing space actually was a massive reality at that time in the world, and I would say that keeps being. And to extent that I would say that the capital, for instance, of the European could no longer be Paris, like in the 19th century, but neither would be London, neither would be Rome, like Berlin, like in the 90s. I would say that the capital of Europe was distributed. It was more a dynamic of people in transit, moving from one place to another. And that needs to be acknowledged, because that is where the political tensions were growing. And within time, we saw what it implied in the Mediterranean. In the last years, this citizenship in transition or in transit became much more important than the subtle citizenship and confronting. And the two of them were confronting. And we see now how divided the world is between those that feel that they belong to a place and they have the right of being citizens of that place, those places, and those that are in transit, those that are really not rooted and forced not to be rooted, forced to displacement due to war, to environmental catastrophe, to inequality, to the inexistence of job opportunities, to sexism and gender violence. So when we put all this together, and it not only for humans, but we see ecosystems in transit, sharks moving in different territories, mackerel moving to Iceland, whereas it was previously caught in Norway. All this probably gives a feeling of how there's a huge tension now between that claims to be rooted and has the power to stay rooted, and those are the things that are forced to migrate. And for me, that was very much reflected and participated through the architecture of those shared apartments, something that was often seen as filthy, as unworthy to be paid attention by architectural minds, and also was challenging because it was unarchitectural in many ways, in the way that Gordon Mataclag would claim his practice being an architectural practice that was really not based on projects or on previous designs, but something that happened more organically in the encounter of circumstances, needs, and technologies and bodies. And for me, that was all those questions were the ones that architecture needed to face. So for me, what was crucial is that in one single case, we could see architecture gaining the opportunity, the laboratory where it could be reconnected to reality, being forced to emerge as real. So it was, you're right, it was foundational for the Office for Political Innovation, and many things came following. And I would say that basically it's also a way to departure from previous forms to understand the politics of architecture. Namely, both this kind of notion of politics that is immaterial, like architects do politics by manifesting themselves, gaining a voice, proclaiming their ideas through discourse, and then trying architecture to be kind of catching up in a way. And I was totally against that. I could claim that this architecture in itself, the way space is organized, the way stones, fabrics, wood, bricks, pipes, wires are brought together, how architecture gains political agency. But also I could say that, but not only, because that's animated in forms of physical interactions, material circulations, things that happen at other scales, either macro or micro. And this is, again, denying this kind of verbal way of being political, being architectural. And that was also something that I wanted to confront. So for me, it was also a moment to claim that architecture is political, but not by the spoken words, but the way that it is part of the material and physical constitution of worlds in plural.
Yeah, which I think I said that I want to return to this idea, or I guess your more recent work, but this idea of a trans-scalar approach to architecture, which is exactly what you're describing. And obviously this talk, I chose the title Intimacy in Distance, and there's that reference to intimate strangers, and then also the experience of social distancing, but digital connection during COVID. But I think it also reflects something about your work and the kind of the mentality behind it, because I think this distinction, it seems to me like for you, this distinction between intimacy and distance doesn't actually exist, and that everything in the world, because of the interconnections you can identify, actually is intimate to us in some way. If you can make the invisible visible, or you can point to the sort of adjacencies and connections. And I really feel, I mean, I didn't get to visit, unfortunately, but everything I've seen about this exhibition you did at the storefront for in architecture, Sex in the So-Called City, I think speaks to that, because it seems to me it's a story about New York, really, but it's told by connecting media depictions through TV, but then architecture, the architecture of Raphael Vignoli, and then building products, real estate, fertility industry, porn, material extraction. Like it's almost a sort of operatic, like what story about New York. And I'm quite interested, if for architecture students or other architects that are interested in starting to think about how they can also approach these ideas of trans-scalar architecture. How do you begin to actually piece together these bits, and what is your approach to actually beginning these types of projects?
This is a great question. And this is actually what I'm doing. I would say that the purpose of the kind of focus of my practice is precisely what you're asking and you're referring to. It's really understand that the notion of architecture as individual projects, as discrete projects, that is very much been the focus of architectural design in the last decades, mostly because of the kind of influence of competitions, needs to be challenged. I don't think architects should work through individual projects. They should be constructing influence by intervening in different points, but having the capacity to connect those different actions and different interventions. Because that's precisely the way that architecture operates as a medium. The action, people get disappointed with the capacity of having a political influence by designing a door, because they try to see the door in itself, not as component of larger systems of power. But when you see the door as a fundamental part of larger systems of power, the very detail of who opens the door, how it is open, become really something that speaks and intervenes, it speaks for and intervenes the entire enactment it is part of. So your question is crucial, because I do believe that architecture now, in order to be a practice that can be politically relevant, needs to be operated trans-scalarly. And that means that needs to be operating at something that is transitioning across scales. I'm not saying that it's multi-scalar. I'm saying that it's precisely in the way some decisions at this scale are considering the impact that they will have at the larger scale or at the smaller scale. It's the way that objects and materialities are transitioning across scales. And that capacity to operate trans-scalarly is what I've been analyzing and kind of describing and exploring this book, Superpowers of Scale, where it's the Sex and the So-Called City project of that you mentioned occupies an important chapter.
Samantha, a cosmopolitan, and Donald Trump. You just don't get more New York than that.
Listen, Ed, I've got to go.
Yeah, good.
But think about it.
Yeah.
I'll be at my office at Trump Tower.
Good. Excuse me. I was so distracted by your beauty. I think I just agreed to finance Mr. Trump's new project. You owe me $150 million.
When it comes to New York, basically, it's even impossible to define what New York is now. Once, for instance, that Bloomberg banned the use of coal or promoted the transition into to gas in the boilers of the city, at the same time that Cuomo was banning the extraction of gas in New York State through horizontal fracking. Those two designs connected immediately moved the NOx that was suspended or kind of part of the air of New York to Susquehanna Valley in Pennsylvania, because gas does not pollute that much in the place where it is burned, but is actually polluting in the place of extraction, especially if it is done through fracking. So for years, we were trying to get the accurate data of the NOx evolution in New York and Susquehanna Valley. And it's quite amazing to see the step that immediately happens at the time that Bloomberg promoted this change in the use of fueling of New York boilers. So when you put all this information together, and there's a lot of it, basically you see how much a tower like Vignoli's 432 Park Avenue Tower, it's not naive. It's not just an elegant design. It's not just, let's say, a nice sculpture. And what is that we can request architects or architecture? Can architecture really change things with regards to inequality? Yeah, it does. Because basically that tower, in the way that it's designed, in the way that it's constructed, in the use of ultra clear glass that maximizes the spectrum of the blue light, in the combination with the Bloomberg designs of the environment, in the combination of regulations, taxes, all that, but specifically the use of concrete, the use of glass, the use of the spatial design, the typological design, it all enacts inequality. And inequality is produced, it's basically designed by architecture, through architecture, as architecture. So in the same way that it is designed for that, it's been designed to challenge that. And there's many cases, for instance, in this Sex and the So-Called Cities, the case of Twin Oaks, an old experiment from the 60s of a bunch of radical architects that keeps working as challenging this order that Bloomberg and others set for New York. So for me, we're part of generations that probably don't feel that comfortable with the legacy of architecture not inspecting, not interrogating its political capacity, and that probably are shaped by the change of paradigm in which we are using that power. Probably we're mobilizing it as infiltrated dissident practices that are progressively having an effect, I would say, and probably will turn architecture into something very different, but something probably much more relevant and needed and worth being part of than the kind of an ideologically claimed claimed as an ideological architecture of the 90s and 2000s.
No, as I said, I think that project is fascinating, and I think it sort of opens up so many different points of entry, I think, to not just to sort of research and critically reflect on what's happening, but also potentially moments to intervene where you can see how that intervention can have a scale of impact that goes far beyond what it might appear just through like its actual form. So yeah, I think it's a great project, and probably speaks so clearly to the work you're doing more broadly within the office and your research. I think lastly, I was just curious to know what you're working on now, because I mean, that Superpowers of Scale is a great document of everything from the last 10, 12 years. But what are you working on now? And I know you've done some initial work thinking around applying this kind of trans-scalar approach to the pandemic, but are there other projects that you're working on at the moment as well?
Yeah, I'm working on a series of projects. It's true that we, Ivan Lopez-Munuera and myself, we did a movie, The Trans-scalar Architecture of COVID-19, that was really reflecting on the way that that architecture has been a fundamental actor in the production of this pandemic. It's easy to find. I could encourage everyone to take a look at it. And I'm also working in this Shanghai Art Biennale that it's already running, and it will conclude with a big, it's kind of a reversed Biennale that it's starting with the public program discussions, the production of the works, and will conclude with a big exhibition in April that it's called Bodies of Water, and it's really exploring wet togetherness now. With amazing artists being part of it, as Caribbean Film Collective from Australia, for instance, as well, and Astida Neymanis, that it's been teaching in Sydney for a long time, and Claire Britton, like to mention some people that are part of the Australian environment, but I must say that I'm also very excited to be working now on architectural projects of, for me, great importance. First, I'm doing this school, the Reggio School in Madrid, which is really a school for a different time, in which basically the entire building is thought of as an opportunity to intensify the sensing capacity of humans with regards to climate crisis. And so basically it's a school that very much reads the Dewey pedagogical tradition of daily life turned into a pedagogical experience, unmediated or as little mediated as possible, an experience of self-learning rather than instruction. So, and the architecture is an architecture that understands curiosity as something that is bodily and that requires prosthetics. So basically the entire school becomes a machine or kind of a device, an artifact to expand the sensing capacity of people together in groups to self-learn in a way, self-educate. And I'm very excited about this project, which is now in the phase where we're in the third floor of structure. So it's very, very exciting. And in the materiality, it's been a big discussion from the movement of the earth to the materials that we're using to the, so it really becomes part of the environment to the extent that the economy allows for it. The second project is the ocean space in Venice, which is a project for TBA 21, the Thyssen-Bornemisza meets Contemporary Art Foundation and TBA 21 Academy, which is a sponge that is literally imbricated, being part of the oceanic system. Of course, Venice is a wetland ecosystem that was dried off historically, and especially with the Napoleon infrastructures and kind of urbanization. We're trying to undo that process of modernity, disconnecting humans to the ocean. So the entire building from its foundations, it's an old church, the San Lorenzo Church, together with some other buildings, compound of buildings of different times, from the kind of manierist architecture to a very recent kind of historicist architecture, that we're really trying to undo the way it was isolated from the ocean, and using that as an opportunity to intensify the capacity of artists, scientists, advocates, activists, victims, humans at large and non-humans or more than humans, to be sensing together and creating a sort of imbricated and solidarian community that promotes the preservation and the kind of intensification of the richness, environmental, political, biological richness of the ocean. And that is a really exciting project. And then we're doing a house in an island in Corpus Christi that is meant not to cater to humans, but actually to protect the island from being eroded through acidification of the water, and it's helping the mangroves growing there to survive, so they can retain the earth and topography, which is fundamental to prevent the pollution from the oil industry to invade the lagoon. We're working also on a house that is the climate dissident house in Murcia, that is bringing back, is kind of a house that connected to others, is reconstructing the Lauretis forest of South, typically from the south of Europe, that was destroyed totally through urbanization and discontinuity brought by infrastructures. So we're developing a number of projects that are, I would say, we're doing buildings, but not only buildings, or buildings that are not really buildings. They go beyond what a building is, and they operate across scales, transitioning across scales. And then we're doing books and other things. So we're very active, and I would say that it's a moment of great excitement in the office.
It sounds
in New York and Madrid. Yeah.
It sounds incredibly exciting, and I think it's also, just that range of projects probably perfectly sums up the diversity of approach and kind of interests, I think, as well of you and your office. So I think it's probably a great note to finish on. And I'd just like to thank you for being so generous with your time. And it's obviously MPavilion programming is normally in person, so this is a bit of an experiment this year to do the first month online like this, but it does create these great opportunities to bring in voices beyond Australia like yourself and who bring really a different perspective that I hope is very interesting to people here. So we were talking before we started that you've visited Melbourne before. I hope you'll come and visit us again, and perhaps even in the context of a future MPavilion program. So Andrés, thank you again for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to seeing these projects as they start to come to fruition as well.
Thank you, Alexis, and I hope to see you very soon in person. Hopefully in Melbourne. That would be amazing.